I'm sure it would probably not go well if I were doing
I
it.
just don't feel pain. That's my name.
Claire, this isn't yours, is it? Oh, no, it's okay. Great.
Because it's like you do all this work and you don't like it, and then you sort of like send it off to your brother, and then like you get right, exactly.
Hi. How are you?
So can we put the software on here that we had
Yeah,
talked about
sure.
today?
I thought it may already be on there.
You're right. I think we might just need to switch these. Let's make sure that it's still running.
I just turned off the Wi-Fi.
Okay, can you go ahead and turn it? Yeah, so it is still installed there.
So I guess I should remember to ask this install, right?
Sure, yeah.
Or it's already been there. It'll probably just take some space.
Yeah, I think it's not even set to restart after you reboot.
Oh, so it'll go away by itself. Oh. There's already a space issue, so.
Added back in
Really
the
like conferences.
hotel network.
Oh. Is that almost always the field? So thank you very much.
So, I guess, so you're going to be live streaming the introduction,
Yeah.
but the rest of it, unless people use my computer.
Okay, you're only doing the introduction.
Yeah,
Okay.
doing the introduction.
Gotcha. Well then it'll probably be fine just for the introduction. So I've got you on the right network here. We should be good to go. Yep, I'm seeing that it's connected. Okay, so I think you're good. Thank you. Here's the software.
Yeah. I think we're going to start pretty soon, everybody.
It's 7 years ago, I don't even remember what I said. Oh, very good.
All right, so I want to welcome everybody to the panel on endangered languages and historical linguistics. And I want to first start by just again thanking Bridget Drinka for all of her work, not only in organizing the whole conference, but specifically in helping to engineer this panel. Also want to thank NSF-DEL for funding that helped to fund all of the participants in the panel, and especially the graduate student participants. That the funding from DEL was really critical for bringing this group together and allowing everybody to have at least some funding. I also want to thank Danny Law and Nama Patel, who are right here, who are co-organizers of the panel. And we all share the feeling that this is an important aspect of an important topic for the field currently. So the fact that endangered languages research and historical linguistics inform each other in really crucial ways and are both helping to propel those subfields further and the field of linguistics more generally. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction, and we have until... So the first talk of the panel will be at 10, so I'll give a introduction that will be not quite so brief, I guess. So I want to first just start by reminding everybody of the situation of endangered languages, which I think everybody in this room is probably familiar with to some degree. But these are figures that come from Campbell 2016, which he got from Ethnologue and EndangeredLanguages.com. But something like 7,105 languages spoken worldwide today, around 7,000 languages, right? Obviously, it's not an easy thing to quantify. Nearly half of these qualify as endangered, meaning that it's likely that they will no longer have speakers after some point in time in the not too distant future. Since 1960, at least 227 languages have ceased to be spoken. So in some parlance gone extinct, and other parlance gone dormant, with the recognition that in some cases it's possible to revive languages that no longer have native speakers so that they can have native speakers again. Of course, this depends on the quality of the documentation that exists. A particularly startling figure is that out of the 420 or so known language families or isolates that exist in the world or have existed, some 24%, or a quarter of these, are no longer spoken of the entire families. So obviously this is a huge part of our understanding of the world's genealogical linguistic diversity. I also want to just highlight the situation in Texas. So this conference there's been a lot of discussion about languages of Texas, but to this point, not a great deal of discussion about the indigenous languages of Texas, which should not be left out of this picture. So this is just a map from the internet. I'm sorry, I did not put a citation, but it is from the internet. So this is the ethno-linguistic distribution of indigenous peoples in Texas in 1776. So, and sadly, a large number of these languages no longer have speakers. So Karankawa, spoken along the coast, is considered unclassified, maybe an isolate. It lost its last speakers in the mid-19th century. Atacapa, also in this eastern region, lost its last speakers in the early 20th century. Tonkawa, another isolate, mid-20th century as well. Caddo in Wichita, my understanding is that there's a handful of elderly speakers, but it's those languages also. Members of the small Caddoan family, another very small, almost isolate group, also nearly gone. So the linguistic history of Texas, if you go back before the European arrival, is not a terribly happy one in terms of what's been carried forward to this time. So just an illustration of the problem of language endangerment and the importance of documentation for maintaining some record of the world's linguistic diversity and having some tangible record for the communities of speakers themselves or communities of heritage speakers. So what about historical linguistics? Why should historical linguists care about endangered languages? Well, obviously there are lots of reasons why everybody should care about endangered languages. You know, the welfare of the communities of descendants, the scientific interest of those languages, and so on and so forth. But I'll focus on specifically the questions that are relevant to historical linguistics. And of these, one might emphasize the question of uniformity over time and space. So historical linguists often make reference to the uniformitarian principle, which has been formulated and reformulated with respect to language in a number of ways in the literature over time. Leboeuf's formulation in 1972 focuses on the forces operating to produce linguistic change as being the same kind and order of magnitude over time. So this is the sort of more conventional formulation of the uniformitarian view, that the same processes that have applied in the past to motivate language change are those that apply throughout time. Lass has a formulation that focuses a little bit more on spatial distribution of processes as well. So, as he puts it, the likelihood of any linguistic state of affairs has always been roughly the same as it is now, and also emphasizing over space as well as over time. So fine, this formulation, on some level, I think no one would want to argue with it, but on another level, how do we actually define the possible range of the forces and states of affairs that we're talking about over space and time? There are clearly processes and situations that are more historically located or more culturally located than others. How do we decide, how do we formulate what processes we want to understand in a uniformitarian view, and separate those from others that we want to understand as more specific? I feel that the only way to really do that is empirically, by investigating what's going on across languages. So just as an illustration of this sort of problem, Claire's talked about glottochronology and the issues of glottochronology, specifically relating to the idea that there's a constant rate of replacement of basic vocabulary. And the issues with the formulation of the view that vocabulary is replaced at a constant rate are very much in keeping with the questions relating to generalizing across space and time. So Lee's Swadesh Lee's constant, the Swadesh Lee's constant that Lee's 1953 came up with, was based primarily on a set of languages that had, so he calibrated the constant. He came up with this by calibrating it based on a set of languages that had a text record that went back more than 1,000 years. 13 languages, so remember about 7,000 spoken in the world. 11 of these Indo-European, 6 of these Romance, and 2 Northern Iberian. Okay? So Guy, 1983, has a really, I think, amusing and to the point critique of this approach, of this methodology. So here he first formulates more or less what Lees did, right? So take 13 languages, 11 Indo-European, 6 Romance, most of which have been at some time the official languages of larger empires, calculate a lot of things about them, claim that the retention rates obtained are representative of all possible languages. Then he goes on to give a lovely analogy that puts this into perspective. So you take 13 people, 11 of them related, 4 cousins, 2 brothers, most of them male adults of the same age group, which we might also add the same environmental and having access to the same sorts of food and the things that might also influence how tall you get. Record the height of each of them, do a bunch of calculations, claim that the heights recorded are representative of the individual heights of all human beings, irrespective of age, sex, or race. Okay? So clearly, if we base all of our generalizations about language change on, for example, Indo-European, there's a potential problem. Just like if we base all our generalizations about how tall or fat or whatever somebody is, human beings are based on people of one particular time period and place and family, again, clearly a problem. So to understand historical processes, it's really important to try to get a empirically broad understanding of how those processes take place in different sorts of contexts. So here, any typologist is well aware of the importance of sampling over language families and geographic regions. But with respect to thinking about historical change, there are other things we might also want to take into account: population histories, typological profiles of the languages, sociocultural contexts, and so on and so forth. The history of the field of historical linguistics has, of course, been pretty heavily focused on Indo-European. So in terms of really moving the field forward and getting a broader empirical basis for our understanding of language change, the investigation of other languages, other parts of the world, historically underrepresented languages, endangered languages, for which we may not have that much more time, obviously these are really crucial. This is a really crucial endeavor. So with respect to endangered language research, we are fortunate in that recent decades have seen a massive increase in the amount of work that's being done on endangered or lesser studied languages. So a lot of this has come sort of to fruition at the same time as more sort of careful formulations of the way the research is carried about have also come to fruition. So in particular, the whole subfield of language documentation. So as Woodbury 2010 puts it, it's the creation, annotation, preservation, and dissemination of transparent records of a language. There's been some discussion in the literature about distinguishing documentation from things like description and analysis, and there's a lot of different sort of opinions about the extent to which those different endeavors should be distinguished or not. Personally, I feel that there's no separating them, that documentation, description, and analysis are all parts of the same enterprise. They're all integrally connected, and while you may focus on one aspect or the other at any given point in your work, you can't do one without the other. At least you can't do it in a really robust and satisfying way. So I also want to emphasize that a lot of contemporary work on endangered languages is carried out in close collaboration with communities, and in many cases is being conducted by community members. So this is another really important aspect of contemporary work on endangered languages. So this panel, I think, does a really nice job of bringing together a really wide representation of endangered language research across the world. So these red dots, which I painstakingly pasted on this map, took more time than I realized it would when I started, especially because I had to look up where some of the languages are actually spoken. I hope I got them right. Anyway, this represents the contributions that we will have today in the panel. So it's obviously a pretty wide global distribution. Unfortunately, both of our Africanists, our representatives of African endangered languages research, weren't able to be here in person, but one does have a poster for the poster session. So Africa will be represented, but unfortunately not as robustly as we had hoped. Okay, so I just want to talk very briefly about what sorts of contributions in what ways historical linguistics and endangered languages research are mutually informative, and bring up some of the contributions that we'll see during the day in the panel that address this question. So clearly there's some challenges, so I won't dwell on them, but there are still huge numbers of languages in the world for which we have very little documentation. So obviously our ability to do any sort of historical work relating to classification or understanding of the histories of those languages and language families is crucially dependent on documentation of the languages. You can't figure anything out about the history if you don't have data on the language. So clearly that's a major contribution of endangered languages research. Another issue is that a lot of the documentary linguistic record is largely synchronic. So whole parts of the world did not have native literary traditions or written traditions. And so for many parts of the world, we essentially don't have any historical corpora, at least nothing going back more than a couple hundred years. In other cases, we do. So obviously where historical corpora exist, it's great to be able to use them. But we also have to recognize that the comparative method gives us tools to work with synchronic data and make historical inferences, and that you don't absolutely need a historical record. And as some of Bloomfield's work, for example, pointed out, in some cases, if the historical record isn't very good, sometimes it's actually not worth it. So what are some of the contributions that endangered languages research makes to our understanding of historical linguistics? Well, first of all, basic sort of bottom line contribution is understanding language relationship and classification. And quite a number of the talks today, in fact, all of them probably in some way or another, but I've highlighted the ones that are particularly focused on this contribution. So just helping to sort out our understanding of relationship and classification by bringing new data to the table. So endangered languages research also can provide evidence in support of cross-linguistically uniform processes. So pointing out that yes, in some applications of our understanding of uniformity are accurate and are validated by looking more widely at languages. So for example, Bloomfield's Central Algonquian Reconstruction is a classic example of how going away from Indo-European, looking at a totally different language family, offered an indication that the comparative method is robust and really works. So he came up with this classification, then later on discovered that Swampy Cree had a distinct reflex in set 5 that validated the reconstruction. And then discovered that Ojibwe, in fact, also did, and that his data, written historical data, was not all that great, which is sort of an interesting twist on the story. Claire Bowen's talk this morning and other work that she has done and that she and I have done in collaboration also helps to demonstrate that cross-linguistically, a lot of our assumptions about language change are robust. So these ideas that hunter-gatherer languages don't have the same sort of borrowing replacement rates and basic vocabulary as we might expect from other languages. In general, this doesn't seem to be true, that the comparative method seems to be effective no matter what your subsistence pattern or what. But then we also have evidence for cross-linguistically variable processes. So there are lots of fun stories in the literature, and including some work that we'll see today, like Eleanor Coghill's talk, that offer evidence for unusual grammaticalization trajectories from a typological perspective, but highlighting the possibility of what language change can do, the possible space in which change can take place. We also have further evidence for variable sources of lexicosemantic and grammatical categories. So Lev Michael's talk is going to address this in discussing a novel source for standard negation coming from privative derivation. There's also the classic work by Evans and Wilkins, and more recently Van Hove, looking and building on work by Sweetser, dealing with the sources of cognition verbs and looking at cross-linguistic variability in the kinds of sources that those come from. We also have processes of historical change that are linked to regional typological profiles. So to the extent that whole continents or large regions can have distinct typological profiles or variation in their typological profiles, sometimes this feeds sorts of historical processes that might then be more common in some regions versus others. So, for example, Eric Campbell's talk today on tone change is building on the fact that these languages, Chatino languages and a number of other languages in Mesoamerica, have extremely complex tone systems. Other work by Eric, together with Tony Woodbury, has shown that there are also previously undocumented patterns of tonogenesis that come out that are evident in these languages as well. We can also talk about the implications of regional context zones for our understanding of context-driven grammaticalization processes. So Marianne's talk that will be coming up tomorrow deals with this topic. Variable social cultural dynamics and the relationship to contact and change is another theme that we've seen in a couple of talks. So my own talk on Monday, Andrew Pick's presentation on reconstruction of a language family in New Guinea also addresses questions of regionally relevant patterns of contact. This is just an example that I won't dwell on, but from Alexandre Francois' work in Vanuatu, illustrating that you've got pretty impressive degrees of divergence in the lexicons of these languages, even where the grammatical structures are basically identical. Another thing that may be cross-linguistically variable is the dynamics of usage and their implications for language change. So having to do with discourse norms, frequency of particular kinds of structures or pragmatic implicatures, and particular kinds of stylistic behavior. So Martin Kohlberger's presentation today will address this for an Amazonian language. This is also one of my, I couldn't help but throw this in here. It's one of my favorite examples from Hoop, the language I work on, where you get this one combination of a reported evidential and a distant past contrast marker that in general in the language are pretty sporadically attested. They're not obligatory or anything like that. But in traditional mythological narrative, you always get them and they always occur together. And in one dialect, they're becoming fused. So I really like this as an illustration of how this one particular genre of traditional narrative seems to be driving this change. So what about the other way around? How does historical linguistics contribute to research on endangered languages? Clearly, this is a two-way street. They mutually inform each other. One of the things that I think is exciting about contemporary approaches to writing grammars and doing language description and documentation is that we're getting away from this Saussurean prohibition against blending synchrony and diachrony. We don't insist that our graduate students write grammars where there's no mention of diachrony, thank goodness. And clearly this is useful. So if you have idiosyncratic synchronic patterns in the language that you're describing, often you can make sense of those by appealing to processes of language change. So some prior work by Marianne looking at ordering puzzles of the Navajo verb is a really nice illustration of this. So she talks about how there's all these puzzles in the way the Navajo verb is put together where, for example, you get things like the verb roots, meaning talk and speak, at two different places within the verbal construction. You get inflectional affixes turning up in unexpected places, things appearing in orders that aren't expected. But she argues that this can be understood if we take a diachronic perspective and understand the way the Navajo verb has been put together as the outcome of ongoing processes of grammaticalization where different elements are grammaticalizing at different times and therefore turning up through different pathways and therefore turning up in different places within the verb. And the verb template is sort of maintaining some of these historical vestiges, and that's why the order is so unusual. There's a lot of that sort of thing that we could say about Amazonian languages as well. So another point, one thing that I think is quite interesting is that where we do have old documentary materials, whether these are, say, for example, in the Amazon basin, we have a lot of well, not a lot, but some things like old Jesuit grammars, for example, from several hundred years ago, languages like Aramaic that several of our participants are involved with have clearly a much older text record. So where those exist, they can inform the documentation of contemporary varieties and also lead to more informed historical work. So this sort of philological component. Megan Lukaniak's presentation today will involve work on the Wendat language of Iroquoian language and looking at historical documentation as well. Finally, just a couple more points. Historical linguistic work can provide really interesting insights into the prehistories of the speakers of the endangered languages. So this is just a nice Amazonian example where you have work by Sergio Meira reconstructs the Proto-Taranoan branch of the Caraban language family. And he shows that, so you probably can't really see it, but these little blue dots are all Caraban languages, and they're mostly located in this area where my cursor is running around in the map, so the sort of northeastern quadrant. And there are some that are more far-flung, of which Carihona, all the way over here in Colombia, is an example. Sergio's work shows that Carihona is actually a close relative of Tirio and Acurio, which are located over here in this other red circle. So these other Caraban languages that are actually closer to Tirio are not as closely related. So clearly this is evidence of a migration history of the Carihona over to Colombia. Probably not that long ago, a few hundred years or so. Manuel Wittmer's talk that we'll have today, The Linguistic Prehistory of the Western Himalayas, also gives some insights into the possible movements of peoples in that region. And finally, an important final point is that understanding more about the prehistories of the speakers can, in some cases, provide opportunities for communities that are socially marginalized to understand and connect to their own past. So Danny Law's talk on language documentation and Maya history will underscore this point for the Ixil speakers who suffered really terribly during the Guatemalan Civil War and have been marginalized in many ways since then as well. But the language documentation work has some real positive outcomes for them. So I just want to emphasize here to conclude that these two sort of subfields of linguistics, historical linguistics and endangered language research, are moving in really new and exciting directions. They're both crucially informing the other, and I think it's fair to say that they're both really pushing each other forward. So in order to have a really robust understanding of language change and how it works in a typological sense, we need to have a really robust empirical basis that draws on a wide range of languages and regions. And conversely, if we have a robust understanding of diachronic pathways and processes, then that will inform our understanding of the synchronic language patterns that we observe both in a language particular case, if we're writing a grammar, for example, or across contemporary languages, if we're doing, for example, typological work, looking at synchronic patterns across languages. So that's all. Thank you. Okay, so without further ado, given that I've gone a little over my time, I'm going to turn it over to Lev. So Lev Michael will be talking about endangered Arawakan languages, reveal a novel source for standard negation, privative derivation.
There's a handout, so maybe that's going around. I don't have one, or I have one, but don't come up here for one. I have a couple of slides for some graphics that I wanted some color for. I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to get this to work. If it doesn't work, we'll just skip the pretty graphics. My computer is frozen up as a result of Congress with this dongle. Okay, my computer's dead. Okay, so we're going to skip the pretty graphics and go straight to the handout, showing the wisdom of using handouts. I want to thank, first of all, the organizers of the panel and also the organizers of the conference. It really looks like it's been a great conference. I just got here this morning from South America, so everyone's been saying great things about it, so I will too. Okay. Okay, so let me begin by observing that the topic of the issue of standard negation constructions has been a major topic in historical linguistics and diachronic morphosyntax since at least the early 20th century. So, for example, we have work on Jespersen cycle, in which a reinforcing or strengthening element is added to a negation construction with the effect that the original negation element weakens and subsequently disappears with that original reinforcing or strengthening element coming to take the place of the negation element. Work by Croft has also shown that negative existentials can serve as the source of standard negation, and work by Gavon and others have shown that lexical verbs like refuse, avoid, and lack can also turn into standard negation markers. What I'll be talking about today is evidence that there's a quite different source for standard negation markers, namely privative derivational suffixes, about which I will say a little bit in just a second. And this comes from Amazonian languages. And there are at least two major Amazonian language families that show the progression of privative suffixes towards and ultimately to standard negation operators, namely the Arawakan family and the Tupian family. There's actually some evidence that there are other Amazonian language families that also show this, but they're small families where it's harder to reconstruct exactly what's going on. But in these two major language families, we have clear evidence of the privative to standard negation evolutionary trajectory. Now, in this talk, what I'll be doing is focusing on Arawakan, and I'll be looking at a particular prefix, ma, and I'm going to reconstruct that as a privative, and I'll show you what that is in just a second. And then I'm going to show the pathways by which this suffix, or its prefix rather, evolved from being a privative to being a standard negation element. And then I'm going to focus on the evolution of this prefix in one particular language so that we can look in some detail how this happens. So let's go back to the bottom of page 1, and we can see what we mean by a privative in Arawakan. So this is a prefix that derives from a noun, a stative verb meaning lack the noun. So for example, we have an example from Baure, a very highly endangered Arawakan language of Bolivia, documented by Svante Danielsson, and you have the word mo einaro, where the nominal root wife, ein, takes the privative prefix mo, and that derives a word of a state of verb root that means be wifeless. Now, this is where I want the graphics. So the graphic is also represented in not quite as pretty a form on the top of page 2. And this describes, this schematizes for you the basic evolutionary trajectory that I'll be talking about, where we go from ma deriving a negative state of verb from a noun. That's, here I'd be pointing with a cursor. It's the second element down from the top, ma n, equals neg v stat, so that drives a negative state of verb. And then the next step in the evolution is that ma goes to applying from only to nouns to also applying directly to state of verbs, thereby becoming a negative, a state of verb negator. And then there's this interesting split, and we're mostly going to be interested in the lower split, where ma becomes a negator for nominalized verbs, extending its distribution as applying to nominal elements, but in subordinate clauses specifically, and nominalized clauses are very common in Amazonian languages in subordinate clauses. And then we're going to see a process of insubordination or insubordination-like processes by which ma appearing on those nominalized subordinate verbs comes to appear in its new guise as a main clause standard negator. So that's what I'll be talking about today. So let me begin by saying that there are approximately 45 living Arawakan languages distributed over much of South America. See map. Over half the language family is highly endangered, with several languages having very recently gone extinct, and others that are on the verge of doing so. Iñapari right now has 4 speakers in southeastern Peru. If anyone wants to work on Iñapari, please tell me. And similarly, there are many Arawakan languages that are in rather dire straits. On the other hand, several Arawakan languages are among the largest and most robust languages of South America, such as the Xeninca dialect continuum in southeastern Peru, and also Wayu spoken in Colombia and Venezuela. For the purposes of this talk, I'll be adapting Walker and Ribeiro's 2011 phylogenetic classification of the family, where basically I'm going to collapse all the nodes that have less than 80% posterior probability, C tree. The important data, or the important classification that results from collapsing those lower posterior probability nodes is summarized in Appendix A at the back, where I have the high confidence classification that results from this and the negation functions of ma in all of those languages. You don't really need to look at it, but it's there for your reference purposes if you're subsequently interested. The one other piece of background that I want to mention before getting into the nitty-gritty is that in general in Arawakan languages, negation is expressed by a preverbal particle, often exhibiting the voiceless velar stop k, for example in Apurina kuna, Baure noka, Kawiyari uka, and so on and so forth. So what we're talking about in this talk is the process by which ma, that privative prefix, comes to replace these preverbal negation particles. So let's talk about ma now. So there's a widespread agreement amongst Arawakanists that this prefix reconstructs to Proto-Arawakan, and it tends to be called a privative in Proto-Arawakan. Easily identifiable and productive reflexes of this prefix ma are found in all major branches of the family. And even in languages where it is no longer productive, you can find frozen examples of this prefix. So in a language that I've worked on, Nanti, one can find, for example, the frozen root in 3, be deaf, from, which is derived from, namely magempi, which is related to the word for ear, gempita. So be earless means to be deaf. And so there's clear evidence that this prefix reconstructs to Proto-Arawakan. The question is, what function did it have in Proto-Arawakan? And the reason why there's doubt about this is because reflexes of this prefix show a wide range of negation-related functions. So this has led, for example, Sascha Eichenwald to say that ma was historically a general negation prefix. So for example, one finds, looking at the examples in 5 through 9, you see ma, or reflexes of Proto-Arawakan ma, functioning as a standard negation element, as a habitual main clause negation element in Baure, as relative clause negation in Apurina, surfacing in adverbial clauses such as purposives and conditionals in Yine, and so on and so forth. So it has this wide range of functions. So the question is then, what function do we wish to attribute to this prefix in Proto-Arawakan? And we can get a handle on reconstructing its function by looking at the distribution of its functions of the modern reflexes of the family. So what I'm now going to do is invite you to turn to the very last page, page 15, and what you'll see here is a table that displays along the x-axis functions of the reflexes of the privative going from the classical denominal privative function all the way to standard negation at the far right. And then along the y-axis from top to bottom, the languages are ordered in terms of how far towards the right they exhibit a function. In other words, so in Yanisha, you have no reflexes of the privative, but in Anyun, you have evidence of one function, namely the denominal, and as you go down, you pick up more and more functions of reflexes of the privative until you get to languages like Lokono, Garifuna, and Tariana that exhibit functions all the way to standard negation. Okay, so why am I having you look at this? So thank you. I am disoriented. Okay, yes. So the generalizations that emerge from this is that first of all, we see evidence of reflexes of the privative in basically all branches but the Yanishan branch. So we wish to reconstruct this morpheme to Proto-Arawakan. And then, when you look at these 10 branches, the following implicational relationship holds. Namely, if ma can directly negate a verb or a nominalized verb, then it necessarily can also function as a denominal privative. So we have an implicational hierarchy here that leads us to conclude that the denominal function is basic and these other verbal negation functions are historically developed from that. So now what I want to do is basically walk us through the processes listed in Figure 1 at the top of page 2 towards from the denominal privative function towards the more standard-like negation, standard negation-like functions. So if a language has any function other than the denominal privative function, it'll also serve to negate stative verbs. And this is the point in section 4. And we see examples of this function in examples 12 and 13. So 12, the girl is pretty, where be pretty is a stative verb root. And in 13, we have the girl is not pretty, using the privative in me, which is the reflex of this morpheme in Apurina. So the point here is that if a language has any function other than the denominal privative function, it will have this function. So this appears to be the next step in the evolution of the privative. Now, at this point, as you can see in the diagram at the top of page 2, the evolution of the privative splits. One function, which is only tested in a modest number of languages, specifically Baure and Wayu, the privative comes to function as main clause negation, but only with a stative interpretation, or stative or habitual interpretation. So if you look at the example from, let's say, Baure in 16, the privative applying to walk yields a meaning, he doesn't walk, but he doesn't walk habitually, okay? So what's happened in this case is that ma has extended from applying only to stative verbs to also applying to active verbs, but nevertheless, you still have a stative or habitual-like interpretation of the resulting derived stem. This is not, this as it turns out is sort of a dead end. This doesn't seem to lead to subsequent, at least in Arawakan languages, to subsequent development of standard negation functions. So what we're now going to do is go to section 6, where we'll talk about the other pathway, which is where ma comes to apply not just to nouns, as it does in all languages that attest it, but also to derived nouns, namely nominalized verbs in subordinate clauses. And we can look at the examples of, on page 5 and 6 in 19 through 22 in Apurina, where we see ma serving to negate subordinate conditional clauses in 19, purposive clauses in 20, relative clauses in 21, and complement clauses in 22. We also have some examples from Paresi, another Arawakan language, in 23 and 24. So what we see here is that there's a relatively large number of languages, altogether 7, listed in the second bullet point in 6, where the privative has extended to this nominalized verb subordinate clause function. For reasons of time, I think what I would now like to do is move to section 6.1, where we see the critical next step, which is that ma goes from the subordinate clause function to functioning as main clause negation. And this happens very clearly in 3 languages, Lokono, Garifuna, and Tariana. Lokono, Garifuna spoken in the littoral and Caribbean area, and Tariana in the Vaupés region in the Colombian-Brazilian border area. Now, the critical thing to notice about these languages in which ma functions as standard negation is that the verbs on which ma appears always exhibit signs of subordination, either nominalizers or subordination suffixes, despite being the only verb or the main verb of the sentences in which they appear. So this seems pretty clear evidence that these verbs, or this construction derives historically from a subordinate clause construction. So let's look at the case of Lokono in 6.1.1 at the top of page 7. And you can see an example of this construction in 26. The free translation is, he didn't give water to you, where the privative ma appears on the verb siki, give, which in turn bears the subordinating suffix n. In addition, all clauses that bear the negation suffix additionally trigger the appearance of an auxiliary verb, generally directly following it, as in the case in 26, where the auxiliary verb a bears the, actually it says second person, that should be third person subject prefix l. And you see similar facts in 27. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the languages in which ma functions as standard negation show clear signs of the construction having insubordinated, or at the very least having come from a subordinate clause construction. And in examples 28 through 31, I basically show you that this element n, the subordinator, is in fact found in subordinate clauses. So in 28, we have a complement of no, I know that he went, where go, osu, bears the subordinating suffix n. And the other examples in 28 through 31 show other instances of n appearing in subordinate clauses. Garifuna is a sister to Lokono and shows a very similar construction. It's more complicated by the fact that Garifuna exhibits a larger number of auxiliaries, which also code for tense and aspect. But the basic story is similar. I want to skip ahead to 6.1.3 on page 8, where I discuss Tariana, which is the third language in which ma functions as standard negation. And here the story is a little less clear. So in 36, you see that ma indeed functions as standard negation. I have not eaten tapir meat, where ma appears on the root hnya, eat. And so this is a main clause, ma functioning to negate the main verb of that clause. But the question is, what precisely is the evidence for subordination here? Well, it's that ma obligatorily co-occurs with a suffix, either kade or kasu, and these are tense suffixes. So kade, non-future tense, or kasu, future tense. Now, the crucial point here is that the general subordinator in Tariana is ka, and is in fact, that's in fact a common suffix found in relative clauses throughout the Arawakan language family. It's not entirely clear what the trajectory is by which that subordinating ka came to be bound together with other bits of morphology in the second part of these suffixes that must co-occur with ma, but it seems likely, nevertheless, that ka is a reflex of a subordinator. It seems like my time is a little short, so I just want to say a little bit about ma, and maybe we can talk about it a little bit more during the Q&A. So critically, if we look on page 9, in example 40, we see a classic example of, actually, let me back up a little bit. In Lokono, the auxiliary appears in a range of constructions. All of these constructions involve the fronting of some element, which is then construed as focused. So if we look at 30, 39, and 40, we can see he screamed suddenly with the adverb baren suddenly towards the right. When you front that, as in 40, you get suddenly he screamed, and up pops the auxiliary. Okay. So the auxiliary is associated with fronting and with focus. We see that also in 41 and 42, where in 41 we have the question, he ran into the jungle. And in 42 we say, no, slowly he walked into it, where the fronted slowly has contrastive focus and can be construed as having contrastive focus from the context. So the point here is that the auxiliary is associated with fronting and with focus. And so the story that I want to tell is basically summarized for Lokono, summarized in 44, where what I want to suggest is that this ma construction, where ma appears on a nominalized subordinated verb, historically subordinated verb, and co-occurs with the auxiliary, derived from an old negation emphasis construction, just like in the Jesperson cycle, where this was a form of emphatic negation, which via pragmatic deflation, with which we're familiar with as a result of work on the Jesperson cycle, eventually came no longer to be seen as focused or emphatic, but now simply the standard way of negating verbs in the language. But crucially, the verb retains the subordinating morphology that is the evidence of its former status as a subordinated construction. So in conclusion, what I've done, or what I've tried to do today, is present evidence for a new source of standard negation, namely privative derivation, that is a denominal negative state of verbalizer, and that the path involves, as summarized in 45, of going from a privative to state of verb negation, to the negation of nominalized verbs in subordinate clauses, and thence, finally, to standard negation. We've looked very briefly at the case of Lokono, where I've argued that the construction in that language resulted from a emphatic negation construction that subsequently underwent pragmatic deflation. Ultimately, the last thing I want to say is that the identification of this novel path for the development of standard negation has depended critically on work by Newman Arawakan linguists and Arawakan speakers, and in many cases, the speakers of highly endangered members of the family. And as a result, we sort of have arguably a case study here of how work on endangered languages can tell us, can give us new ideas about the diachronic pathways involved in morphosyntax. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I had a question about the data in Lokono.
Yeah.
in section 7.
Yeah.
So I don't know enough about the basic syntax, but if I understood correctly, the negation involves a special focused word order with an initial negation. So I wonder if in standard negation now in Locono also there's a different word order for negated and non-negated clauses.
There is. So that's right. So if you look at, so we need to go back to the data in 6.1.1. So if you look at 26 and 27, you'll see that the negated element, actually, thank you very much for asking this question. The negated element appears in that fronted position before the auxiliary. Yeah.
Great.
So that's exactly right.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for asking that question.
Okay, well,
Let me remember what it was.
All right.
okay, I'll
After
pass
Claire.
it back. I just wanted to make a comment about Australian languages, which also have privative strategies. There's some overlap between the declarative negation and the privative negation. I'd always assumed it had gone in the other direction from, say, focused constituent negation and then just affixization. But this has made me think about it's probably more complicated. So thank you for.
Right. Yeah, thank you. I had a bullet point here about Australian privatives, exactly. So it doesn't seem like there's been a lot of historical work done on the privatives in the Australian languages, but the work that has been done is that the claim runs the other way. But there hasn't seemed to have been a lot of evidence adduced to that. But you could easily imagine that it could work differently, like the paths could run in opposite directions in different parts of the world. It'd be really interesting to see an Australianist dig into this and see which way it seems to go in Australia. Yeah.
Okay, I remembered.
Great.
Okay, and it's a follow-up of the earlier question, and it's
Yes.
a nitpicky question about your Locono data because it was really interesting, and I like your hypothesis for how this arose. So the question is, in 6.1.1, you've got examples of non-negated subordinated clauses in 28 through 31,
Yes.
right? And they have that N suffix for the subordinated clause.
Yeah.
And so I think the missing link then would be, can you front non-negated subordinate clauses and get the auxiliary there?
Yeah, that's the question.
That is the question.
That is the question. The answer is that the descriptive materials do not say. However, Konrad Rybka, who's worked on Locono, recently came to Berkeley and has promised to answer this question. I think we'll know in a couple of months what the answer to that question is. So then I guess the question I'm inclined to ask is, what would it mean if that didn't happen? Like, what would it mean if you didn't get positive polarity subordinates in this kind of cleft-like construction? And that would require probably some fancy footwork if that turned out to be the case. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Marianne?
You know what would be interesting if you have good sound files would be to compare the prosodic contours on real focus constructions where you see that there's, a discourse reason for focus versus sort of run-of-the-mill negative constructions and see whether you've got sort of a
Right.
dampening of the prosodic signal.
Yeah, that's a wonderful idea. Yeah. So would you expect that because it is grammaticalized into this, it would have gotten quite
Yeah,
flattened?
that would be the idea.
Yeah.
But of course, you might have sort of very focal negation, like, no, it's not that, it's this, versus, I didn't have anything to eat, so.
Yeah. No, thank you for the suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah,
Oh, or is it?
sorry, here.
Sorry.
Back to the question of this in Australian languages. I wasn't surprised because in the language I work on, Kaiticha, this is a standard way of, what is a nominal privative occurs on verbs with a verb with a non-finite marker plus a nominal privative, and it's just a standard negation. But I never really thought about the pathway, like why it's at, the fact that there's a subordinator is interesting. And nor have I looked at typologically how widespread this is in Australia. But while we're on Australian negatives, negative imperative is quite interesting. In many languages, it's a particle that can be seen to come from just a verb meaning leave it in other languages. Now, in Kaidic, the negative imperative has an inflection, which also looks like it's a nominalizer plus an ergative suffix. So I suspect that it comes from an abbreviation of a construction, not doing something, leave it. And then you leave out the verb, and it becomes the negator for intransitive verbs as well as transitives. So there's some interesting historical processes. You've given us ideas on what to explore.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to be coming to talk to you right now.
Thank you. Coincidentally, ma is the main negation in Yanomami. And the very interesting thing is ma alone, it's an independent word. And when it is alone, it's a negative adverb or a negative answer. But in a sentence, ma has aspectual marker also. But this is a different point. I don't know if you find some negation with aspectual marker.
Let me respond to the first thing you said about ma being found in Yanomami. So ma is all over South America, and how many people work on language families where ma is associated with negation? Right. Yeah. So there's, I mean, each time I read something about negation, I'm like, oh, there's ma again. You know, it'll be Africa or in Oceania or something like that. So there's something about I mean, someone actually needs to look at this, but there's a disproportionately high probability of M often followed by A in negation contexts, and I don't understand why that is. Your question about the association with negation and aspect, in general, I have not noticed that in the Arawakan data. But,
We should probably stop here so that everybody can get coffee. Thank you very much, Lev, for a fabulous talk. And we will reconvene shortly after the coffee break.
Are you okay if I get them loaded really quick and then?
Oh yeah. So you do that? No, I haven't done it yet. I do. Yeah. I've actually got notes on paper on my hand. May actually fix them out.
Do you see the other people here?
This is me.
Okay.
Danny.
You know.
Oh, Danny. Here comes Danny.
Great.
Thanks, Sue. Poor Danny. You're amazing. You took my presents yesterday.
Okay, so you know we're live streaming, right? To be able to get the data on the stream, you have to install some software. Okay. And that sends it to the encoding machine right there. Is that going to work for you? Sure. Okay.
So I guess each of us has to set their own computer?
No, I think we're sharing this computer.
Yeah, I mean, so
I have mine on the flash disk. I do the last presentation.
Oh, yeah.
So my preference would be, since we're moving pretty quick, if we could put it on here.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
I know people
Why
are
I'm
sometimes
here.
worried about.
I got nervous
the
because
displaying right. We could take this and export it as a
I've got
PDF, I
this
guess.
PDF.
okay, this is so much better to do it this way.
Yeah.
We have so little time.
Yeah.
And we don't want to spend
I was sharing where somebody said that, I've sent it to myself by email. I was like, okay. There's internet, isn't there? Like, I don't know. So then, fortunately, somebody she had a Mac, so somebody had an adapter, otherwise.
the one thing that I didn't propose, I should have probably only connect. I have it on a flash disk. I have it on
that's
a
fine.
computer.
Yeah.
And I assume it did. It's just so much easier for each of us to walk up. To start and not to have
One
to.
already.
Even if everything
Oh, yeah.
works, even if everything works, it takes a few minutes. So, okay, I'll do mine next.
Should I put Yeah. Yeah. And we'll
It's easy to find it on the desktop. This room is so wonderful. Screens and
Let me.
Oh, yeah.
So it's set up for presenter view right now for PowerPoint. So let me just set this to. Okay, so now go ahead and try it.
yeah, now it's
No, I need.
that's great. Looks great.
But it shouldn't have the. You shouldn't have this thing at the top. Full screen. Yeah, control L. Oh, I'm doing FN. That's fine. Yeah, that's fine. Do I have to do what you did?
How do you
I don't know what Daddy's doing. Is he using PowerPoint?
No, that's why I'm
Keynote.
converting this to a PDF because I produced it in Keynote on a Mac, and
Oh,
this
right.
one's not going to be able
So
to do
you'll
that.
also be.
Will this work for you? Because we can do this. It just.
We'll try it out.
Okay. Yeah, let's try it.
I assume it'll work just
Okay, so
fine.
you're good here.
Yeah, and you'll be around if I.
Let me try mine. I also have one I made on the Mac. Will that be a problem?
Did you export it as PDF or is it Keynote?
I can make it into PDF.
Is it you used Keynote to do it, or it's PowerPoint?
I have PowerPoint.
Okay, PowerPoint will be fine on here.
Okay, let me do a little test run. Just to make sure. Okay, so I put mine on next. Where does this go?
Yeah. How are we doing on time here? What time are we starting?
We got a little time and
Yeah, that's another option. Let's see if we can get these. Maybe can you stick around for just a couple minutes? I think we'll be done here in short amount.
I get it. And so I just want to make sure.
My preference is to use this if we can, just so we can switch things over quickly.
Yeah, that's much better. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, try that for sure.
I want to move my. Oh, I guess it's. How do you move? I just want to move it where it's not a lot of stuff right there. Just put it up here. That's perfect.
Okay.
And so. Just
Yeah,
put double.
this one and this one are both buttons.
So then there's the slideshow.
just
Do you have any notes you're using?
Well, I have it
Built into the-
on paper that I look at. Okay, so that won't be a problem. This is perfect if I can. Oh, that's absolutely perfect. And how do I advance it?
Just left and right.
and it's actually kind of a bad thing.
So this is advancing.
Earlier
It's
in the
advancing
computer,
on its own. I
how
don't
focused you are on getting it prepared.
I clicked this
Since I
one.
don't get nervous until like 10 minutes before my talk. Oh wait, I
So
should have
all I have to
worked
do is
harder
this.
on this. You know, that sort of thing.
Okay.
It's
Great.
So that's really perfect. Let me get out of your way.
And you're.
So yeah, it's back there.
I like to hide it.
Okay, now thanks. I feel a lot better. And then I have my prepared notes on a piece of paper, so I thought that would be easy.
Okay. Great.
It's excellent. Because I'm going to use every second of my time.
Just have a touch.
Didn't want to waste it.
Yeah, I think it was just over on the other one. Okay, I'll take it. Thank you.
I feel like I'm wearing gloves whenever I'm using a PC laptop because I'm so used to the way the Macs work.
I own a Mac, but I still feel that way on a Mac. Just
Oh, really?
grew up with it.
Okay.
So before you do this, PowerPoint has switched us back into extended desktop mode. So let me just switch that back. Just so you can see how it'll actually look once you're done. Okay. Will that work?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you for flexing on that.
So, should I, let's see, Megan, you needed to put yours on?
Yeah, I was gonna put mine on. If it's, I have time later, I can do it as well. If you wanna.
Let me
Yeah, that's
do this really quick, and then
Something
if we
I
have
can do,
still time,
so,
yeah,
there's no
lunch
rush.
at worst case.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's a big one, huh? Got a bunch of pictures in there?
Yeah, so that's these are the notes. Okay. So hang on,
So if we put it on
Yeah,
the
we-
slideshow view, it should.
no, okay, yes, it just got that, but I'll see
Okay,
the
so over
notes
here
now.
is.
Now, how do you have a mouse? No.
But I think this is a little bit adjustable. So I think we can get a little more space.
Yeah, we like to, so that's big enough to see the slide, but if increase that text area, push it up. Yes, yeah,
Slide is
that's better.
least important.
Yeah, I don't really care what the spelling is. Okay. Great. That reasonably sized font, I think.
Do you want to
Let me just,
space through a couple times and make
Like
sure
that.
that it's never overflowing?
this looks fine to me.
Okay. Great.
Need to go, don't have to go all the way. So it's on the desktop, so.
Yeah, let's go ahead and name it however you'd like.
So just put my name beginning.
Okay. Let me eject. Thanks. You're welcome. Thank you. All right, we've got 2 minutes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, there were some Hideout community members there. Okay, excellent. But they weren't involved in the film themselves, but I think that Pat would know, maybe even ask Jorge. He was at UBC and see, he might know. Yeah. Yeah. I know, I hope that I'm able to be there. I hope my workshop goes through, but we'll see.
You're the next speaker, right?
Yep.
Okay. So I have thanked or stolen 5 seconds to the beginning of the next one. That's all right.
Okay.
I was just going to remind people that to do this, we need group documentation. So a good opportunity would be to send your students or summer to Florida.
Yeah, it's an appropriate time to plug Colex, that's for sure.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay, great.
You're welcome to continue on and give my talk. You could probably handle it.
No, I want to hear what you say. That's what I'm here for.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
go ahead. You didn't have anything visual that you were doing? Okay.
All right, let me know if you need anything. I'll be back.
Thank you. So he's going to talk just for 5 seconds about Poland, and then I'll talk. I don't know. Do you want me to just go ahead and start? All right. Yeah. Right, do you want to go ahead and? I think it's time. Yeah, it's time. It's 10:45 is the starting
All right.
point. So do you want to?
Sure. Are you the session chair?
Yeah, but I can do, the owner is not here.
Okay.
Then I can wait a little bit. No?
Well, we'll run out of time.
Okay.
All right. I'm sorry to be screwing around with your time, Dan. Please excuse me. All right, so we're going to be beginning the next session now, and I've stolen just 10 seconds from the beginning of this to say to people that the ability to do this work is dependent on good descriptive work and good language documentation. An excellent opportunity to learn how to do that would be CoLang, which is happening next summer at University of Florida. I've got flyers here, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody who'd like to know more about it. Thank you very much.
So we are now beginning the second set of talks in the session. I also just wanted to make a very quick announcement that the posters, I've just been finding out about the posters. We're still working out where those will be displayed, but the presentations by the students who have put together the posters will be this afternoon, so we'll hear more about that later. So now I'm going to turn it over to Danny Law, who will talk about how language documentation is changing Mayan history.
Thank you. And I just want to thank everybody that's participated so far and helped to organize this panel and the conference in general. I think it's been really fun. I had never participated in ITCHL before, and it's a really fantastic conference. The title of my talk, How Language Documentation is Changing Mayan History, is intentionally vague. Because I want to think about this in two different ways. How language documentation changes our understanding of the linguistic history of Mayan languages, and how historical linguistics is impacting Mayan history for speakers of Mayan languages in particular. So looking kind of from both directions. What do I get out of it? What do speakers of these languages potentially get out of it? And just for a little bit of orientation, those of you who aren't familiar with the Maya area, that round thing in the upper right-hand corner is planet Earth. And we're slightly above center on this particular perspective on it, and the Maya area is down in southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and historically, in any case, parts of Honduras and El Salvador. Up close, you can see the Maya region. It's dominated by these mountainous highlands to the south, and then a large lowland plain stretching up north into the Yucatan Peninsula. This is a picture from NASA that I always like to share. Those red dots are actually fires that are clearing out forest in the area. This was during the burning season, clearing season. This is an area with a lot of ecological diversity, very important, but also an area where there's a lot of ecological loss. And linguistic loss is definitely a part of that. So when you think about the Maya area, this is generally the image that comes to mind. This is a drawing that was done in the mid-1800s. A lot of early explorers in the area went into the Maya region and discovered a lot of these places. And I put kind of quotes around discovery simply because the way that they discovered them was to go and ask people that lived in the area, what's neat to see around here? And so the people would bring them to these places that they were well aware of. Many of these large dramatic sites that were hidden in the jungles were abandoned. That doesn't mean that people weren't aware of them or aware of some details of their history, but they had been abandoned for some time. And this, I'll talk about this a little bit later. It is kind of relevant to this story, believe it or not, but the big mystery for Europeans arriving in this area was who could possibly have built these things. And it's, in retrospect, not mysterious at all. There were a lot of people around there and living it when the Spaniards, when Europeans arrived, who participated in this very sophisticated and advanced society that continued to be sophisticated and advanced up to and through the time that the Europeans arrived. But there was kind of a failure of creativity on the part of Europeans to connect the people living there at the time with the history of the region. And so that's going to be kind of a theme I'll come back to. The other important thing to note about the Maya area, for those of us that are language nerds, which hopefully would be pretty much everybody in here, is that there are hieroglyphic texts. And so this sets it apart. It's embarrassing in comparison to some of the textual richness that you get in say, the Middle East, but it's unprecedented in the New World. We have hieroglyphic inscriptions that go back a little bit more than 2,000 years, and thousands of them, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25,000 hieroglyphic inscriptions. And these record actual language, so you can look at, obviously not phonetics too much, but you can study the phonology, the syntax, the morphology. You can look at these languages as languages in these early texts. Here's just an example of a panel from Canquén, where I've done a little bit of a very general analysis of what's there linguistically. You can see everything that's blue is a date, so these would be temporal adverbial phrases, and everything that's green is a finite verb phrase, verb. Everything in yellow is a preposition or a relational noun, and all the other stuff are noun phrases of various kinds, various functions. So I mean, we can go through these texts and get a lot linguistically out of them. I spent some time on that because people sometimes don't believe it when you say that this is recording an actual language. The Mayan language family is puny in comparison to some of the families that were Pama-Nyungan, for example, and some of the other large families out there. I like it. I like the size of it. 32 languages, give or take a couple, that are mostly still all still spoken in the area that I mentioned. And in terms of time depth, the estimates are around 4,000 to 5,000 years of diversification. Here's a little bit about the geography of the region. This is, in broad terms, what the linguistic geography looked like around the time of the Spanish conquest. And this is what it looks like today. To process that a little bit, the one big difference is this language Cholti, which is number 9 on this map. It occupied a vast region in the middle of the Maya area, in the jungle area of the Petén, and went extinct. And I'm going to be talking about Cholti in part of this this presentation. There are a lot of other differences as well, but I also, since this is about endangered languages and language documentation, I included some statistics of numbers of speakers. You can see that we have some languages that have upwards of 1 million speakers, and some languages that have, here listed, Itza 123, Mocho 170. I think, at least in the case of Mocho, I have personal experience, and that's a bit high. I think there probably are, I would guess, maybe half that many right now. All of them in their 70s and above. So there are 2 languages that have gone extinct that we have documentation for the last 400 years. So I wanted to talk a little bit about documentation of Mayan languages, and along the way give some sense of what that has meant and how it interacts and has interacted with our understanding of the linguistic history of the Mayan language family. The very first documentation efforts that we could think of as documentation efforts were done by Spanish priests they wrote these, what they would call artes, basically grammatical sketches. And in many cases, they're not terribly helpful for understanding the language, but in some cases, that's all we have. And so it's a valuable resource for looking at these languages. And after that, you really don't have a lot of linguistic research on Mayan languages until the mid to late 19th century, where you have European scholars, many Germans and Americans, who I call linguistic explorers. They would travel around from town to town and gather a very strange assortment of random lexical lists, and small lexical lists. So I'm not exactly sure how this would work, but they would travel for days, presumably on horseback or being carried in litters by local people. And then they would get to a town and they would elicit 20 words or so, and then they would move on to the next town. And so if we're thinking about the history of language relationships in the family, we have right here the language Chorti for about 60 years was placed in the Quichean branch of the family, because the linguistic explorer that went to the Chorti area didn't bother to figure out if the person he was talking to was actually from that town. And so he actually got the list of words for a language called Pocomam, but thought that it was Chorti. And then there were 2 big waves of documentation starting in the 1960s with Norm MacWown and then later Terry Kaufman, and many others connected with the work of those 2 people. And then in the 1990s, with the efforts of Nora England, a lot of native speakers of Mayan languages were trained in linguistics and began documenting languages. And from the 2000 to present, there's been what I would see as a second wave of a large number of people studying in very great detail several of the Mayan languages. So as you can see, there's been kind of an explosion of documentation of Mayan languages just in the last 50 years or so. When I was trying to think about how to articulate the contributions of language documentation to our understanding of historical linguistics for Mayan, the real obstacle was trying to choose an example out of the hundreds of possible examples. So I'm just going to give one briefly of this, but the general argument here, which hopefully is not very controversial, is that more data is better, and documenting languages gives you more data, and so you can figure more things out. The example I'm going to give is about spectral innovations in Cholan, a subgroup of the Mayan family. And there it is right there. So when we reconstruct aspect, starting with Terry Kaufman's work, we've had enough data on Mayan languages to reconstruct the aspectual system. There was, in Proto-Mayan, obligatory grammatical aspect distinction between, at very least, completive and incompletive, or perfective and imperfective aspect. That was done through prefix ka for incompletive and sha, or possibly null, unmarked, for the completive aspect. And I'm just kind of rapidly carrying you through, as you can see, from Proto-Mayan, if we're moving towards the Cholan subgroup, the next node is Cholan Tseltalan. And Tseltalan languages essentially maintained that Proto-Mayan system. That's with some phonological changes, but that's the main takeaway. Proto-Cholan, however, and Cholan languages are dramatically different in the way that they mark aspect. And I'm here focusing, for the sake of time, just on that contrast between incompletive and completive aspect, not the whole system. For Cholan languages that are spoken today, incompletive aspect is marked by using a nominative accusative pattern of person marking and a suffix that is associated with that particular aspect. And the completive aspect, they follow an ergative pattern of person marking and have a different set of suffixes, right? So these are in both senses innovative. Because that is the system you find in all four surviving languages today, the assumption pretty reasonably was that this is something that we could reconstruct to Proto-Cholan. This is a Proto-Cholan innovation in person marking. But if you look in more detail, and as we were able to gather more documentation and description of these languages, details start to pop up that cause problems for that analysis. Chol and Chontal, Western Cholan languages, have, as I said, this system pretty clearly established, but Chorti doesn't actually follow an accusative pattern in the incompletive. It has a tripartite pattern of alignment. Chorti developed a third set of person markers that is only used on intransitive verbs in the incompletive aspect. So it's very, very different. And then if you look formally at it, Chorti also lacks that suffix that I was talking about for marking aspectual distinctions that the other languages have. And when you look at that when you look at the distribution of languages that have split ergativity of this type that make aspectual distinctions based on ergative or non-ergative patterns of person marking, you can see that there's this nice clean areal distribution, right? And again, all of this these are things that we weren't able to see earlier because there just was not enough data about these languages. And then a really key piece of evidence actually comes from that first step of language documentation that I was talking about. There's this colonial language that's no longer spoken, it's extinct, and it's only recorded in one colonial document. But if a careful analysis of that language shows that you don't actually have split ergativity in incompletive aspect or in this language, that you just have a straight ergative system. And you only have something that you could think of as split ergativity in the progressive. And in that case, it's clearly that you have a nominalized form of the verb, right? And so what all of this says is with that extra document from colonial Cholti, we're able to pretty firmly establish that, contrary to what you would expect, we always are looking for the simplest explanation, but the story that seems to make the most sense in light of all of this data is that the Cholan languages actually lost their obligatory aspectual distinctions and then reacquired that through contact with neighboring languages at different points in time and in slightly different ways. And without this documentation of Cholti that was carried out by a priest in 1695, we would not really be able to make that case, right? That would be too complex of a scenario to justify reconstructing, right? So in summary, perhaps I can summarize all of this with saying that that if we did not have this additional documentation and data, we would not know this important detail of the history of that subgroup. Now I want to switch over to talk a little bit about the consequences of historical linguistics research in endangered language communities. And for this, I'm going to just talk about my current work in one Mayan community, which is a community of Ixil Mayan speakers, and kind of the reaction on the part of those people to this project and to my linguistic research, which I never, as I went into this project initially, I didn't think this would be of much interest. It's certainly not of much interest to most of my non-linguist friends, so I assumed it also would be rather boring to speakers of Ixil, and found quite the opposite. And I think this has the interest that speakers of these languages have in historical linguistic findings has to do, I think, with one crucial fact about many of these marginalized communities, and that that these people are often what Eric Wolf calls people without history. Right, so marginalized communities tend to be left out of the dominant historical narrative of a region, or if they're included in the same way that that the flora and fauna of the region are included, right? Not as historical acts of peoples, but as part of the scenery, I suppose. And so, and deriving from that, also in an institutional level, public education in these areas generally teaches the dominant historical narrative, and that leaves marginalized communities with a sense that they are ahistorical. Right? Related to that is this, what we could call synchronic or atemporal cultural descriptions, and this has to do with choices made on the part of ethnographers, anthropologists, describing indigenous communities, that is connected intellectually to Saussure's synchrony and diachrony, right? The idea that when you're talking about cultural systems, you have to describe it as a synchronic system, which essentially means that it's a cultural system outside of time. So you have these people that are disconnected from history doubly through the erasure of history in dominant kind of discourses, and then also through this presentation of their culture and society as being atemporal. And this is not, it seems like a kind of abstract intellectual exercise for us, but for people in the Ixil region anyway, they keenly feel that sense of being unmoored to history. So this is my language documentation project. The team, we have 7 native speakers of Ixil, 1 PhD student, and myself. I'm the one in the middle. And we're documenting 3 different varieties of the 3 dialects of Ixil that have been for 3 years. The main point that I wanted to talk about is that I also have been doing this series of community workshops, which have been very widely, surprisingly attended, and have attracted a lot of interest. And the comment that I've received over and over and over again from many people in many ways is, this is our history that they never taught us in school. So when I talk about simple things like that there's the Mamayan subgroup, and that Ixil is part of that subgroup, and people are fascinated by that. because they know who the Oaxacatecos are, and they know who the Mom are, and they know something about their history, and they have had stories told to them in their homes about their relationships with these people. And so this is, in a sense, validating that traditional history. So I'm kind of out of time, but I'll conclude. Unsurprisingly, new data equals new historical linguistic insights. The more data is better. Hopefully nobody objects to that. And the number of speakers of a language is not necessarily indicative of the language's value for historical linguistic investigation. I think, in fact, because we tend to not have access to the data, endangered languages very often have information that really revolutionizes our understanding because our hypotheses were formed without considering them. And then those same marginalizing processes that lead to language endangerment also frequently work to erase the histories of communities of speakers of endangered languages. And because of this, our historical insights and linguistic trajectories are perhaps nowhere in the general public more apt to be appreciated than among marginalized language communities. And I'll leave it at that. So thank you. Thought we were over that.
Hi, Danny. Thank you for a very informative talk. I'll admit that I don't know much about the Mayan history and interaction between the groups. What I found in other places when you tell people, oh, you're related to that other group linguistically, is that you can have a mixed reaction. So some people, depending on their history with that other group, accept this very willingly, and they're happy to learn that. If they had a history of antagonism with that other group, then that kind of puts you in a very awkward position of, you know, they're really not like us kind of thing. Do you get any of this, or?
Not with the Ixil, but with some other communities that I've worked in, I have had responses along those lines, or a kind of a sense of disbelief. But I think that there's an important space for discussion and collaboration there. You know, with people saying that there's a way to approach traditional stories. You know, one of the big parts of traditional stories in the Ixil area is that is where corn was first emerged, and it's clear archaeologically that is not where corn was first domesticated. And I've, as part of the workshops that where we went over the history of the language and the region, both archaeologically and linguistically, we talked about that, and it was a very interesting discussion. And I think the important perspective to have on it when you're talking about these is to value those traditional perspectives on history as well, and not pretend that our way of approaching history is more valid than that way, right? And I think that in my experience anyway, they're able to say, okay, well, this is another way of looking at history, if that makes sense. But that's an excellent point, an excellent question. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we should probably end there. Thank you. So for our next speaker, there is a handout which is going around. This is Eleanor Coghill, who will be speaking about Northeastern Neo-Aramaic, an endangered language unusually rich in synchronic and diachronic attestation.
I'm sorry, there's not quite enough handouts, but they're the same as the presentation, except I made a few changes since printing. So the Aramaic language family has a 3,000-year-long historical record, and it still survives in pockets within the Middle East, although it becomes ever more endangered along with its speakers. The largest branch sorry. The largest branch, Northeastern Neo-Aramaic, or NINA as we call it, covers many varieties, many of which are mutually incomprehensible to each other, so it's extremely varied. But war and persecution and ethnic cleansing of the Christian and Jewish communities who speak Aramaic, I should also mention the Mandeans, but they're in a different branch, have driven most of the dialects into near extinction. And this continues today, especially 3 years ago when ISIS surged into northern Iraq. Nevertheless, many have been documented, especially over the last decades. This is the Cambridge Northeastern Neo-Aramaic database from a project headed by Jeffrey Kahn here. And we have very many entries, that's just A and B, although, you know, a varied amount of data in each entry. But much remains still to be done, and it becomes ever more urgent. Northeastern Neo-Aramaic also has an unusually long written history. Jewish and Christian communities in Iraq began to write religious literature in their local vernacular as far back as the late 16th century. So they produced manuscripts in the Christian communities around Mosul, and there are also Jewish manuscripts from the town of Nerewa, near the border with Turkey. Here you can see 2 publications of such manuscripts. In addition, we have documentation by missionaries and scholars active in the region in the 19th century and early 20th century. So, sources for diachronic studies on Nina include written records of Aramaic varieties going back 3,000 years, written records of a few Nina dialects going back about 400 years, and recent fieldwork data on dozens of Nina dialects of all kinds. And this is me in Damascus doing fieldwork. I should say most fieldwork has been done in the diaspora because so many of the speakers have fled their homeland. So what is the significance of the last source, recent fieldwork data, for historical linguistics? Well, there are many gaps in historical records for Aramaic. Only a minority of dialects leave a trace in the written record, whether in ancient times or more recent times. And the best documented ancient Aramaic varieties are from outside the geographical region where Nina is today spoken. Also, the early manuscripts in Nina were in the Christian dialects of the Mosul Plain and the Jewish dialect of Nerewa. And this reflects only a small part of the diversity attested even today. And it's important to have this diversity. The more diversity you have, the more chance there is of finding archaic features surviving somewhere, often on the fringe, in the fringe dialects, but not only. And we get more material on which to reconstruct the ancestral forms. Also, closely related dialects may exhibit different stages of the same change, like a grammaticalization. And I have some examples where documentation of diverse endangered dialects has been crucial in establishing what happened. So example 1, establishing the existence of tense conditioned ergative alignment at an earlier stage of Nina. And this received support from the documentation by Jeffrey Kahn of extremely endangered Jewish Southeast Trans-Zab dialects, which still retain this alignment to some degree. And in my book, I relied on this topic, the development and then loss of ergative alignment. I relied on data from around 30 different dialects in my reconstruction of the earlier stages. I'll gloss over the next example. I move on to example 3, which is the main part of my talk, the grammaticalization of a past perfective marker from a verb of movement. So this study relies on evidence from written records, from fieldwork, and from cross-linguistic parallels. Now, this past perfective marker, kham, is a verbal prefix found in many Nina dialects, and it expresses the past perfective, so you typically find it in narrative. It has various forms across different dialects, kham, kim, qim, gim, also tem if that's actually the same prefix. And it's attached to the so-called present base. It's a stem which is derived from an old active participle in earlier Aramaic. When unprefixed, this stem, present base, has an irrealis function, but it may take a prefix to express the indicative present, like he goes, he walks, or another to express the future. For past perfective forms, normally you find you're using the past base, so a different stem. So then the question arises, what is the role of kam and present base? So kam and present base is used with an equivalent past perfective function to the past base, except that it's normally restricted to verbs with an object suffix. And in some dialects, it's only past perfective form to allow a full set of object suffixes. Here we have examples from Al-Qosh. So 1a, shakla, she takes, with a K prefix on the present base. And for the past perfective, we use the past base. So shqalla, she took. Then we have object suffixes in C and D. Well, shaqlaluh, she takes you. Well, D, this is not allowed. So it's a past base with an object infix. And you do find it in some dialects still existing, but it's not allowed in this dialect and many others. Instead, you find 1e, kim shaqlaluh. So instead of using the past base form, you use the present base with this kim prefix, which is a variant of kam. I should say the 1d, it shows an inversion of the functions of the person markers, the subject and object markers. So it's a kind of complicated system. In the present base forms, one is the subject and one is the object. In the past base forms, they reverse their functions. But in 1e, you're using the same object suffix as in the other tenses, so it's a bit simpler. Now, there have been various theories as to where this prefix kam comes from and the form. So the first one was it came from Aramaic qdam, which became kam later on, meaning before. This was Nöldeke in the 19th century. The second one was it arose out of the earlier Aramaic verb qaddem, or qdam, is in another derivation, meaning he was or did something beforehand. Then the third theory was that it arose from the verb qiyama, to get up, to rise, in the form, with the present base form, qayyim, he gets up. And this was proposed by Pennacchietti in 1994 and 1997. To read his articles, you need to read either Hebrew or Italian. So it's not so well known. And most recently, Fassberg, in 2015, criticized these theories and suggested it arises from the meta-analysis of the present indicative prefix k with an initial m of some of the present base stems. I'll argue, however, that dialectal data shows that qiyama occurs as an auxiliary verb, or possibly a serial verb, actually, with a similar function to the kam prefix, and that this makes Pennacchietti's theory far more plausible, and that Fassberg's arguments can all be rejected. And as Pennacchietti himself showed, this is backed up by cross-linguistic parallels, in particular the Catalan go past. I won't try to pronounce that, but it's literally I go to sing, meaning I sang, and other parallels in Romance. So turning to theory one, that it came from qdam before, and this was proposed by Nöldeke and accepted by some other scholars. But Nöldeke translated qdam as früher, vorher, meaning formerly, but it's actually a preposition before, okay, as noted by Pennacchietti and others. And I'm surprised at Nöldeke because he was a great Semitist. I'm not quite sure why he made this mistake. So why would a preposition be used by a verb, before a verb? There's also the possibility that related adverb qamaya, formerly from qadmaya in earlier Aramaic, is a contender, but you would require more phonetic reduction. So theory two, that it came from qadem or qdam, both meaning he was something before or he did something before. And this was proposed by Arthur MacLean, who was an Anglican missionary and scholar, a great Neo-Aramaic scholar, and accepted by Reuben and Khan. Now, qadem and qdam are both Aramaic suffix conjugation forms. But this would point to a very early origin, as the suffix conjugation is nowhere found in modern Nina, not even in the earliest records from the 16th century. Its functions had at that time already been completely taken over by past base forms. So this would mean that the come plus present base developed prior to the emergence of Neo-Aramaic. However, come plus present base seems to be rather a late development. So Alessandro Mengozzi in 2012 traces its expansion over 400 years from a very rare form to a very common one in Nina texts, where it gradually displaces the past base forms with object infixes. And Fassberg found other objections to it. And in this scenario, it originates in a dynamic, historic, present or future within a narrative context. So one could say that, and then the final stage would be where the verb loses its inflection and becomes phonetically reduced to qam. Qam shaqilla uzilla, qam shaqlila uzilla. And of course, in some dialect, qam then change phonetically further to kim or gim, qim, and so on. At first sight, this is surprising, as we expect verbs of movement like qiyama to be used as future tense, not past tense auxiliaries. Penacchietti's evidence was the following. He pointed out in his survey of many Neo-Aramaic and Neo-Arabic verbal prefixes expressing tam values, all derived from auxiliary verbs. So this is very normal. And he rejected qadem on a phonetic basis, that you should reduce to qad, not qam. He pointed out that qayyim is actually used as a tam auxiliary in some dialects, expressing imminent future, albeit. And there's also another verb of motion which has that role. But the crucial evidence is that in some dialects it is found expressing past perfective. And the evidence for this was in Retreré's 1912 grammar of the Mosul Plain dialects, based on his own fieldwork, attesting to this construction, alongside the Kim construction. Kim is a variant of Qam. So Retteré presented inflected Qaim as an alternative to Kim for expressing the pronominal object in a préterie, as he called it, calling it une forme énergique. Qaim qatille, meaning literally arising he kills him, but essentially immediately he killed him. But he didn't make the connection, actually, between qaim, inflected, and kim. And there's a similar construction with another verb of motion, ithaya, to come, which we find in Maclean's 1901 dictionary, but I won't read that out. And Penacchietti notes that all these examples have a pronominal object, just like come. Moreover, there are cross-linguistic parallels to this development, a verb of motion in the present tense becoming a past marker, namely in the go pasts in Romance varieties, like Catalan, early French, Guardia Piemontese, Occitan, Calabria, and so on. But then Fassberg, in a 2015 article, argued against this qayyim origin. He pointed out that the inflected qayyim construction exists alongside qam plus present base in Retteré's material in that grammar, showing that qayyim is far from being grammaticalized, and therefore kim or qam has a different origin. Following Rubin, he also pointed out that qayyim or qa'im, as it would have been earlier, is the origin of the indicative prefix k, implying it cannot be the origin of both. So then he proposed a new scenario, the meta-analysis scenario, that Kim resulted from the meta-analysis of the indicative prefix with an initial m of some present base stems. So k is an important tam prefix in many Nina dialects. It makes a subjunctive present base indicative. So shaqal, he may take, becomes kshaqal, he takes, like habitual. And scholars generally agree that this k arises from an earlier Aramaic auxiliary qa'im, he stands, cognate with our verb qiyama, which was used to express continuous aspect originally, as in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, where it could take the form qa'im, qa'e, qa. So Rav, qa, mufarish, Rav is explaining. Now, in the present day, k plus present base is sometimes used as a historical present, so it is used in narrative. The present base stem, it occurs in 4 different derivational patterns, 3 of which begin with m. So he proposed that Kim resulted from a meta-analysis of k plus the epenthetic vowel e, and then m, when it was used in historical present function. So ki mshadira became kim shadira, and it was reanalyzed as kim mshadira. And he pointed out that derived verbs with m are normally transitive and require a direct object. He also claimed that k already has a perfect function, but that was a bit unclear to me. And he gives some other examples of meta-analysis of particles in Neo-Aramaic and earlier Aramaic. In this scenario, kim would be the earliest variant, and kham would have arisen by analogy with some other words, kham before and khamaya formerly. Okay. Now, but I would argue that Fassberg's new scenario is actually quite weak, and that Penacchietti's scenario is much more plausible. So for his meta-analysis scenario, his examples of meta-analysis are of 2 prefixes combining, not of the boundary between prefix and stem changing. Also, I'm not aware of cross-linguistic parallels to this, although I'm open to hearing them. He argued that the fact that the Qayyim construction exists alongside Kham shows that Qayyim is far from being grammaticalized, and therefore Kim Kham has a different origin, but a grammaticalized morpheme can exist alongside the less grammaticalized version, as in English is going to Ngana, and we have an example also in Neo-Aramaic. Following Rubin, he also argued that it's the origin of indicative prefix k, implying it can't be the origin of both. But these grammaticalizations took place at quite different times. They originate in different senses of the verb, so one is the stative sense and one is dynamic. And there is no reason why a given form cannot undergo polygrammaticalization. And while Qayyim, the Qayyim construction, the inflected verb, developed into a past perfective marker, it has an additional use in allowing pronominal objects to be expressed in the past perfective with L suffixes, exactly in the same way as other tense aspect mood forms. So this may have encouraged its popularity and motivated its further grammaticalization. And we have further evidence from Romance for how such a construction may develop. Detges, in 2004, pointed out that Old French il va dire had inchoative aspect. So, like, all of a sudden, he says. Sometimes it was inflected in the past tense, as in they started to set up camp. And we also find this in Nina. We see Qim Lazilla, he got up and went. It's very common in narrative to introduce a new turn of events. In the next step, the inchoative construction was used as a discourse structuring device. So he contrasts Bernie hits Paul with Bernie starts hitting Paul. Now, clearly, the second inchoative version is more dynamic and therefore more appropriate to catch the listener's attention. And then it became used also for non-inchoative events as a rhetorical device to represent especially dramatic points of narrative sequences. Okay, and we find this also in Nina, and it was conventionalized as a procedure to structure narrative texts, and in most cases combined with the historic present for a double whammy of dynamicity. And it was in the present tense, the stronger form, that it became conventionalized as a grammatical item as also in Nina. And then step 3, it was originally, earlier it had a grammatical function, but was a marked form. But in Catalan, it replaced the old synthetic past simple, and this happened through overuse, in which it lost its marked status. And recent fieldwork has brought to light further examples from other Nina dialects to add to those that Pennacchietti brought to our awareness. For instance, Jewish Cella, which is actually documented by Fassberg himself, and he pointed out these examples, but didn't find them convincing for Pennacchietti's theory. So, yeah, he went to gather his debtors in the past perfective, and then Qemi Qatlile, they rose up and killed him, or they rise up and kill him, literally. And there's a suspected example in Christian Kochanis, but that depends on making a correction. All of these use the bare present base, which is a bit surprising because it's subjunctive. You expect it to mean they may rise up, he may rise up. But actually, this can be used as historic present, as I showed in an article. So to summarize, I would argue that Pennacchietti's hypothesis is the most plausible one. The construction with the inflected qaim is attested in several dialects and sources, past and present, with the same tam values as the grammaticalized form, and exclusively with pronominal object on the lexical verb, as with the grammaticalized form. So there is a plausible scenario for grammaticalization, and there are cross-linguistic parallels and romance to this. And there's no problem in multiple grammaticalizations from the same source, and the other theories are seriously flawed. And finally, to point to the connection to our theme, the fieldwork of many scholars from the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries was crucial for the identification of this construction and the reconstruction of its development. In particular, detailed documentation of dialectal variations, and not just one dialect, but many, many dialects, as vital evidence came from multiple dialects. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I haven't read your work, but I'm interested to know whether you looked at local Arabic dialects, because of course gam occurs exactly in the same way, including in my own dialect.
Oh, I know, yes. I would like to look at that.
But so you haven't?
Well, no, I'm aware of it, but I'm not aware of it being used in this kind of, I mean, in a structuring way, like in narrative, like he got up and he went, but in a grammaticalized way, I don't know.
Well, I wouldn't know without analyzing it, but much of what you said, most of these examples from Aramaic would absolutely translate very nicely into the local Arabic dialects.
Yeah, well, I'd like to talk to you about that afterwards. Sure. Thank you.
About multiple prefixes or multiple suffixes. Eskimoan languages are beautiful examples of coalescence of adjacent suffixes, frequently co-occurring adjacent suffixes. There's something like 500 derivational suffixes, and it's just rampant examples of things coming together and coalescing. So it's really common.
But this is not the case of that. That's the examples he gave.
Yeah.
But this one is actually a prefix coalescing, well, basically the border between the prefix and the stem changing. So part of the stem joins the prefix.
Right.
And then that becomes reanalyzed and grammaticalized and everything. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, coming back to Enam remarks, you have similar developments in Sudanese dialects, in Bagara, where you have an auxiliary gam used for a past perfective with the movement verbs, whereas the progressive is marked by guide, so by sitting. by the participle of sitting. So I think it's quite common in Semitic, broadly speaking. So it's.
Is the verb to get up used
Yeah,
in the
it's
present?
the verb to get up with the movement verbs, but is the verb to get up is not a proverbial marker. Is the perfective conjugation of the verb get up plus perfective conjugation of the main verb.
Yeah. So
But
he got
it's
up, he went.
Yeah, but it's not. It's not. I mean, it's highly grammaticalized, so it's part of the auxiliaries of these dialects actually.
Oh, right.
And it's pretty common in Sudan. So
Yeah, I think it's covered in Brustad's grammar for some, maybe in Kuwaiti Arabic.
I don't know, but yeah, probably.
Yeah, but very much for in that case, for structuring, you know, like, and he got up, he went, and you know, for a narrative. But I'd be interested to hear more about Sudanese.
I don't know. I think that it has no lexical value. It's is a true
yeah, absolutely
aspect value marked by the auxiliary. So yeah.
Mm.
Sure. Thank you for the talk. It was a little hard for the non-Semiticist in the audience to follow some parts, but I wondered if I could ask for a little clarification about why the come prefix appears with the present base rather than the past base. I think perhaps you explained this, but I didn't quite follow.
Well, originally I thought it was a kind of auxiliary, and then an auxiliary would naturally take, for the subordination, it would take the present base, which is kind of subjunctive. That's what you have all the time. But actually, maybe it's more of a serial verb, because you get it also, you get qimla zilla, he rose, he went, a lot. So you get, you know, chained with another verb without a coordinator, and normally both in the same tense. So this could be the same. It's like he gets up, he eats, or he gets up, he goes. So and since come comes from the present base, then the other one would also be in the present base. And the point is, it's a historic present in origin, which also gives it this vitality and dynamicity. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't have a handout, but I have a PowerPoint that's pretty detailed.
So our next speaker is Edward Vida, who will be speaking about patterns of retention and innovation in Dene Yenisei and verb morphology.
I study an endangered language of Siberia called Ket. And this presentation will start with an overview of language endangerment in North Asia, and then describe what Ket in particular can contribute to historical linguistics. Now, 4 centuries ago, what is now Russian North Asia contained over 40 languages, something like 40 languages belonging to at least 10 distinct families. And today, only a few of these languages have any chance of survival into the next century. The degree of language endangerment in North Asia is directly connected with the traditional economies of the people and the size of the population, as in many other areas of the world. Most Siberian natives were reindeer breeders who nomadized in small bands, and they were similar to hunter-gatherers, and their linguistic fate is similar to hunter-gatherers in most of the world as well. All of their languages are highly endangered. Now, reindeer breeders spread across Siberia only in the last 2,000 or so years. So this is a recent development. And they presumably absorbed hunter-gatherer societies that were in the area before them. The hunter-gatherers are sometimes called Paleo-Siberians or Paleo-Asiatics, even though they belong to at least 6 distinct language families. And sometimes the pastoralists are called Uralo-Altaic languages, but these are at least 4 distinct language families as well. Now, Ket is not related to any of the other Paleo-Siberian languages. Those survived on the Pacific Rim because this was an area that was very difficult for reindeer breeding. It was very rugged, and it was easier for hunting and fishing. But Ket survived in a completely different part of North Asia because of the extreme number of mosquitoes, which made reindeer breeding in herds almost impossible. I could give you more stories about that, but I don't think you want them. Ket is the sole survivor of what used to be a large language family. And it was already under threat. It was already being replaced by the reindeer breeders before the Russians came in about 400 years ago. And the Ket language also had greater extent, you can see in the past from substrate river names that were absorbed by the pastoralists, shows that it originally was from Lake Baikal and Mongolia all the way almost to the Urals and the Arctic. So it was a very, very large language family, not too distantly into the past. And the czars in Siberia extracted fur tax from the natives, but they didn't mess with the cultures too much. And so almost all of those languages survived into the 20th century. The real fundamental change that started language disappearance came with Stalinization, a collectivization where the native peoples were forced to live in Russian-style villages and punished for speaking their own languages in the 30s and 40s. And so that has resulted in almost a wholesale replacement by Russian of native languages of this area, most of which are only spoken by elderly people today. Only languages of the horse breeding societies, which were stratified and complex and could compete with the Russians, are still extant and healthy. Now, the Yeniseian peoples, the Ket peoples, the ones that remain, live in a small corner of Siberia about the size of California, but Texas is bigger, okay? And it's very, very difficult to get to. And yet still only a handful of speakers remain. Everybody else has switched to Russian because of the Soviet policies of the 1930s and 1940s. It's very difficult to get to this area. It took me 7 planes, 3 trains, a little bit of hitchhiking, and a 4.5-hour helicopter ride to get to the main village where the Ket people live. And I believe I was the only English-speaking person ever in history to visit this area, the only person from North America ever to visit this area. No, the only foreigner since 1928 to go into this area. So the value of Ket for studying for historical linguistics is threefold. There's interest in genetic relatedness of the Kets. There's interest in language contact with the non-related languages around it. And also there's universal features that understanding internal development in Ket linguistic structures can contribute to our understanding of the diachronic typology of languages. Part of my research has been involved in the idea that the Yeniseian languages are, improbable idea, that the Yeniseian languages are related to one single North American language family, Dene Yeniseian, and the preliminary results of that was published about 10 years ago in Alaska. The best review of that was by Lyle Campbell, who's very astute, and having worked on this for several years more, I can say that he pinpointed exactly the problems, exactly the weak points, and since that time, the lexical evidence is much greater. The evidence from morphology is almost, I would say, overwhelming at this point, but that actually exacerbated the third problem, and that is the historical time depth. How can intricate homology, submerged features in verb morphology and other aspects of the morphology be able to survive 10, 20,000 years? It really doesn't make any sense that that's possible. Fortunately, the hypothesis was thought promising enough that a group of Russian geneticists got interested in seeing if there could be a human genetic connection between the two groups of people. And in the last 2 years, they did a full genomic study of the Ket DNA and found that these people were indeed ancient North Asians, not people who had come to North Asia from the south recently. They also found that they were more connected with Native Americans than any other inter-Asian people, but the connection, again, was too long ago in the past. It was something like 20,000 years ago, so it's not probable that could be any linguistic evidence of that. So once again, the problem remained, but one of Pavel Flegontov's results was very intriguing. He discovered that the Kets share a specific close DNA connection with people who came into Alaska 4,800 years ago who had been traditionally called the Paleo-Eskimos, who had created the Arctic small tools tradition. And this was unexpected. The genome of the Paleo-Eskimos had only been sequenced in 2010 and had never been compared with the Kets. And so he got the idea that this group of people who came in so late maybe mixed with some first Americans, and that produced the Na-Dene people and the Na-Dene language family. And he was able to show that, in fact, this is the case. His research in the last year shows that it was this mixing. And although 90% of the DNA of the modern Navajos and Tlingit are the same as first Americans, there's a 10 to 15% that comes directly from this mixing event that was about 4,600 years ago, shared by all Na-Dene people, speaking peoples, and not by anybody else. So this is a direct human genetic link that can be traced to about 6,500 to 7,000 years ago with the modern Kets. And that fits perfectly with the known archaeology of North Asia, where we have the Sialach culture bringing the bow and arrow for the first time into North Asia, and then also continuing with the Belkachi culture to this Latin migration. There hadn't been a migration between, say, 15 or 16,000 years to about 4,800 years ago, but this migration had DNA directly connected with the Kets. So perhaps this is the language, this is the archaeology and genetic link that would be connected with the Na-Dene language family. However, none of what I just told you adds a single shred of evidence that languages are related. Only linguistic evidence can show that. But at least it shows it's not absolutely impossible. And for me, that was a good result. Still today, Lyle Campbell's original astute assessment remains, and only if a lot more evidence is published and reviewed and accepted, overwhelmingly universally accepted, well, we'd be able to call this a language family. My research is actually more concerned with the role of the historical development of Ket in North Asia, its interaction with other families. I think the aerial linguistic feature of Ket is at least as interesting as the possibility that it's related to the Na-Dene family, and that's what I've been researching. And using the Dene-Nisene hypothesis as a base to look at how the Ket language has changed in North Asia. The Ket people were mixing, taking young brides in from all of the surrounding tribes, all of which spoke suffixing agglutinative languages, really a very different type of language than what we have in traditional early Ket and Yeniseian languages. So Ket accommodated to the surrounding suffixical agglutinating languages as a result of this contact over many, many centuries, and had little lexical borrowing to go along with that. And this produced unusual typological features in Ket, such as clitics that sometimes surface as prefixes, sometimes as suffixes, and also a templatic verb with inherited core template that sometimes restructured as suffixing and sometimes remained as prefixing. So those are kind of unusual features from this language mixing. Yeah. And so Ket prefixes became enclitics on any available preceding word, so that the root of the word would be word initial, just like in the suffixing languages around it. And if you look at the Dene and Nisene comparisons, it appears that we have a prefix, a nasal connector, and then the possessed noun. The nasal connector eroded in both Na-Dene and also in Yeniseian, but there's all sorts of features of it left everywhere. Looking at it this way explains a host of irregularities in both language families. But what happened in Yeniseian is that these prefixes, especially in Ket, gradually detached. They became proclitics and then eventually enclitics, and sometimes they switch back and forth, something that is called a ditropic clitic, which is very unusual typologically, and this is from aerial influence. And so the modern Ket has these enormous strings of postposed relational morphemes that originally were nested possessive constructions with possessive prefixes. And so it looks like the suffixal agglutinating languages that are surrounding it, but the internal morphology shows that it's a very different kind of structure originally. And there's prefix avoidance in modern Ket to the extent that you even say an epenthetic vowel that you can put the enclitic on so you can avoid saying a prefix. And so this is pretty unusual. But the explanation is the language contact. So Ket today also has originally a strongly prefixing verb, but this verb became suffixing in an interesting way. The verb form you see at the top is the traditional type of prefixing structure, but all the productive, there's 33 productive models of Ket verb formation, and all of them have had grammaticalization of the original verb prefix into a sort of transitivity or valence marker. And then the incorporate position has incorporated an action nominal, which is actually a verb root, and that becomes the main semantic head of the word. The prefix before it, the subject prefix before it, winds up detaching and becoming an enclitic on the preceding word, and voila, without changing any of the original morpheme positions in the verb, you wind up with the suffixing verb where originally you had a prefixing verb. So in Ket, you have prefixing verbs and suffixing verbs that have the same morphological structures. It's a kind of an unusual thing. When we go deeper, we look at the diachrony of the Yeniseian verb structure, we see that the templatic morphology has persisted for a long time despite its complexity. It's interesting that the metathesis and reanalysis happen to be the most common ways that the verb has changed over time, and not by adding or losing any morpheme positions. And this is exactly the same in Na-Dene, in the parallel evolution of Na-Dene, the same process we see. If you look at the three templates of Na-Dene languages, the Athabascan, Proto-Athabascan, Eyak, and Tlingit, the templates of the complex prefixing verb are so similar that the cognacy was recognized over a century before the language family was actually proven by finding enough cognates. It's a universally accepted language family now, without Haida, which is unrelated. But here I've highlighted one prefix, the S conjugation prefix. And this one stayed in its place in Athabascan and has its tam meaning in Athabascan as well. In Eyak, it's hopscotched by metathesis for some reason ahead of the subject prefixes. So it's right before the verb base, but it still has its tam function. In Tlingit, it's hopscotched, and it's also lost its original function so that it's become part of the classifier system. But it's the same morpheme, and you can see that all of these prefix positions remained, all of the morphemes remained, but we have some metathesis and reanalysis. The exact same thing happened in Ket. You can take, this is too long for this talk to go into this, but you can show the origin of both Dene and also Yeniseian by this model of coalescence of a verb that is auxiliary that had inflections, and also a main verb that had inflections into a prefixing structure, and that gives rise to everything, including the classifiers in Na-Dene, which all have, every bit of them have cognates with what we see in Yeniseian. But the rest of this talk, I want to talk about three odd features in Ket: metathesis, semantic reanalysis, and multiple exponents. These, I think, by studying this endangered language Ket, can contribute to our knowledge of typology across languages. Metathesis is something that we usually regard as a mistake, but no one's, to my knowledge, has done a cross-linguistic survey on metathesis. But in Yeniseian, metathesis is quite common, especially in Ket, and it sometimes seems to follow regular rules. Whether this is because of language contact, I really don't know. But when you look at the Ket vocabulary and the extinct language, sister language Kot vocabulary, you see that Yeniseian has undergone specific types of metatheses that you could actually write rules for. And if there's a Na-Dene cognate, it always is like the Kot without having undergone those rules. And there's several varieties of metathesis that I could give a whole lecture on. It's very interesting. And metathesis also has affected the verb template, just like it did in Dene, but in different ways in both families. In cat, but not in cot, you have a metathesis of certain sounds, the same sounds you have outside of the verb, and sometimes this has caused a change in the actual morpheme positions, in the templatic positions, because the morphemes have switched for phonological reasons. And so sometimes we get a morpheme that was, say, what Athabascans would call a qualifier, Russians, we would call it a determiner, and you understand, it metathesizes forward, and it looks exactly like an agreement marker, an inanimate class agreement marker. And as a result of that, it triggers semantic reanalysis. It becomes replaced by agreement markers for animate objects. And yet the agreement for animate objects and inanimate objects too is in another part of the verb, so that results in what is called multiple exponents, or I call it multi-site agreement marking in Yeniseian, which is actually quite rampant. Fortunately for a small linguist like myself, who only studies one language family, or one and a half, it's very wonderful when we have a cross-linguistic survey that sheds light on some of the unusual features that I'm experiencing in Yeniseian. And Alice Harris has just recently, a few months ago, published a book on multiple exponents, where she describes specific types of multiple exponents across the world's languages. And in cat, which she just mentioned might have multiple exponents, she doesn't have any examples. We have rampant examples of everything that she has in her book. We even have what she calls exuberant multiple exponents. It's my favorite example from Cott, where you seem to have the animate plural subject agreement marked 4 different times. She has examples from languages that are as exuberant as this. Her examples go into 4 categories, which I put into 3 when I look at the cat examples. There's coalescence, where you have words with different affixes coming together. And then we have refurbishing, where a morpheme has become eroded or marginalized and has to be replaced by the same morpheme somewhere else. And then there's a grab bag called accidental. Yeniseian has all of these, and it has a lot of examples of the so-called accidental, and even shows what maybe is the reason for accidental, what is the motivation for it. Well, the coalescent multi-site marking we can see from this model of Proto-Dene Yeniseian, which resulted in tam marking as prefixes and subjects, suffixes on both sides of the verb. And this happened in both families. We have the stative resultative cognate morphemes that look like circumfixes, but they're really multi-site prefixes and subjects on both sides of the verbs. This is in both families. But cat started to lose its a morpheme that marked the subject, the speech act participant subject right before the verb. It started to erode phonologically, and it was refurbished. That's the second example of multiple exponents from Alice Harris' book. And so cat made a new series of prefixes at the very beginning of the verb. And still we have some of the original prefixes that survive and result in multi-site subject marking. Cot, the sister language, put suffixes at the very opposite end of the verb to refurbish these eroding prefixes, and these were borrowed from concord agreement on nouns and adjectives. And so they came with their own plural part, and that had to be added, and that resulted in plural multi-site subject marking also. And sometimes it's quite striking because for phonological reasons I don't quite understand, sometimes the entire original subject prefix is preserved, and we have in both ket and cot multi-site subject agreement marking multiple exponents in completely different parts of the verb. And this is the refurbishing type. Now we get to something that I think is the reason for the accidental multiple exponents, and that is a semantic reanalysis. There's so much of it in cat. I've written about 800-page dictionary of and this Yeniseian etymological dictionary, and I've had to invent symbols for this because it's so frequent inside the Yeniseian language family. And when we look at this, we find a lot of the multiple exponents in ket is not refurbishing, it's not coalescent, it's in fact because of semantic reanalysis of various sorts, accidental because of that. And with that explained, I don't know whether the accidental examples in Alice Harris' books from Algonquin or from Nagtagastani, I don't know if they're from semantic reanalysis, but she does doesn't entertain the possibility, and maybe we could check that to see if that's the case. With this, we are now able to explain this exuberant multiple exponents in Cot. And so some of these prefixes are originally inherited from Dene-Yeniseian. Some of them are added by refurbishment, and some of them are the original TAM multiple exponents of the prefix and suffix of the coalescent verb template that has been reanalyzed in Yeniseian as plural marking because of coincidental resemblance to a plural suffix. And the original aspectual usage of these you can still see in many words because these survive not only in verbs that have plural subjects, but also sometimes in verbs that have inanimate singular subjects. And so there's evidence, there's submerged evidence of the original function, just like for the not-any classifiers. There's original evidence of what they originally were, some in forms that are exceptional. And my last slide here is going back to metathesis. Is it an error? Is it a tendency? Is it a rule? I think a language like Ket that only has about 30 native speakers left could perhaps give us some insight across linguistically on what metathesis could be besides just a mistake. It could answer some really interesting questions and then maybe address things that could be looked at again in language families that are already somewhat described or even better described. And so I want to thank our hosts for a wonderful conference. Very, very, very grateful for being invited here. Thank you very much. There's a question here. Yes.
Thank you. So thank you for your talk. It just reminded me of my postgraduate interest in all kinds of exotic languages. So the question is about the so-called typological profiling, because since that's about morphology, so far as I remember, Krajinovic, who wrote one of the first descriptions of the Ket language.
Oh, Krajinovic, yes.
Krajinovic, yes, in the 1930s, I'm not mistaken.
In 1968.
It was published, yeah. Okay, and Mishaninov also, it seems to me they identified these languages as typical polysynthetic languages. Do you agree with these, or we have a different typological assessment of these
you know that
structures?
There's a handbook of polysynthesis coming out just in a few months. With Dr. Mithun is one of the editors of that book. There'll be two chapters having to do with Ket and Dene-Yeniseian in that volume. If it all depends on how you define polysynthesis. If you define polysynthesis as having at least two of the following features, then Ket is definitely it. The features is polypersonalism and incorporation of heavy lexical material, so you have more than one heavy lexical root, and also the interdigitation of inflection as well as derivation inside the verb form. Ket has all three of those features, in fact. There are verbs that have all three, so undoubtedly, however you define polysynthesis, Ket is polysynthetic. However, the incorporation of heavy lexical material in Ket is very constrained. There are only a few formulas that allow it. Instead of using the incorporation for rejuvenating the verb core meaning. And so Ket is undoubtedly polysynthetic, but it's in a constrained way. So that would be my answer. So I would agree with my predecessors. Yeah, yes.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I have maybe a question to remind myself of something that you presented earlier, and then maybe a comment, not a question. But it seemed like you were saying for the phonological evidence of this connection, what we have is Lyle Campbell's work, is that right? And then how many lexical items was that?
Well, Lyle Campbell critiqued my work. No, he didn't ever do any, he wouldn't be foolhardy enough to do Dene-Yeniseian work, but the amount of cognates is somewhere between 100 and 150, at least at current time. It was probably about 80 or so when Lyle Campbell critiqued it, and he found all the ones that were wrong. He was really good about that, and I really appreciate that. But I think that unless there's, I think there's between 150 or 200 if there's not those convincing cognates, don't accept it when all of this is published. That's what I predict. There are holes in the sound correspondences. For instance, I can't, and that's why I didn't talk about this at just 20 minutes. I don't have enough time to talk about all the problems with that hypothesis, so I went in a little bit different direction. But the glottalized onset consonants, I'm having trouble exactly explaining how they correlate with the Yeniseian, and there's a couple things like that. But all the cognates are in basic vocabulary, exactly what you'd expect them to be if it's a language family.
So I think I really just have a comment, not a question. So
Yeah.
sorry to take up some of your question
No.
periods. But I don't know if I will promote my colleague, James Crippen, who works on Tlingit.
Oh yeah, I'm
right?
closely connected with him.
So, and you may then know that he, along with Rosemary Deschênes and Emily Elfner at York University, are working on the prosodic system in Tlingit right now.
Yes.
But as you already know, Tlingit's quite conservative in a lot of ways. So,
Oh, yes.
you know, if you want to find those sound correspondences, I think Tlingit is the place to look.
Well, it's interesting because when you have two language families that might have a connection, some particular branches are conservative in one way, and they're not conservative in another, and Tlingit's that way. There's some things in Tlingit that are indeed conservative, and some things are not. They've innovated, like that S getting into the classifiers, or you have that perfective wu prefix. That is actually metathesized backwards into the verb, and it is cognate with this nasal in Yeniseian, and so that is not. And also, Tlingit has gotten more glottalization, and definitely even looking at Athabascan, so it's not conservative in that way either. So it depends on what language you look at. Yeah, but that's interesting to consider. Yeah. Yes, there's another question here perhaps, and then here, yeah? Because of microphone moving?
Right, we have a decline of microphone movement. But I wanted to ask about the semantic change in the morphological structure in the prefixes. So in Nyol and in the Northwest Australian language, I did some language family. I did some work on for my dissertation. We have situations where different prefixes look like they've undergone semantic shift. For instance, between transitivity and tense marking and so on. The forms are the sound changes are very transparent, so it's easy to find the cognacy. But when you look into it a bit more, what has actually happened, rather than a semantic shift, is a structural change such that collapses in some parts of the paradigm have led to a reanalysis and a shifting of categories. So the linear order is the same, but the combinations of null and overt items lead to a grammatical reanalysis. And so I was wondering if you find similar sorts of things in Ket as well. So it's not the semantics that are changing, but it's the morphological structure, but the linear order is being preserved.
What's happening mostly in Ket is that we have a affix, sometimes a derivational affix, sometimes what was originally a tam marker, an inflectional marker, that becomes unproductive in its function, or its function is taken over by something else. And then it's still in the word because of the straitjacket of the template. And what happens is people start mistakenly recognizing it as something else that it looks like. And this happens outside the verb system with adjectives. Adjectives originally in Yeniseian all had a suffix that made them into an adjective. It was probably an existential verb. It happened to look like a nominal suffix that meant plural. And so what happened is that we have certain sound changes that maybe we had forms that it was reduced to a tone, and other forms where it was full. The forms that were full looked like plural. And so what happened was the forms that were full started being used with plural nouns. The ones that were not full, didn't have that, started being used everywhere else. But we have lots of examples where we have the form with the plural that's still used with the singular, especially in the more conservative Yuh language. So I think it's a case of mistaken identity, kind of like that's the main motivation in Yeniseian, and it's kind of amazing. I start wondering whether more language contact has to do with some of these things that I'm describing. Yeah. And that happened in the action nominal as well. The noun form that is made from the verb, which is exactly the same formula as in Na Dene, we have a prefix, then you have the verb, then you have a suffix. The prefix and suffix are different, and they're cognate. The suffix looks like the plural, and so it winds up being used as a pluractional marker where it survived. It's really, really an interesting thing. Yes. And there was a question here. Sorry to keep you waiting.
I think
I will answer very quickly.
I'm mostly working on Sino-Tibetan languages, which have sometimes equally complex morphology, and there you get sometimes variable ordering of prefix and suffix strings. So I just wanted to ask you whether you had come across similar phenomena in Ket or the other languages in
In
North
Ket
America.
language, when we have somewhat variable prefix ordering, I can always show that it's due to metathesis. And there was one place where you have a coalescence of two morphemes, and once in a while you still have the original order of those two morphemes. But it isn't variable in a conscious sense by the Ket. It seems to be because of those processes. Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you, Patty. Thank you for being a wonderful host of this panel.
So thanks, everybody. We will reconvene after lunch.
Okay. Well, we kept on time. That was good. Thank you so much. Thank you for your question.
You know, I'm right next door to you. I live in Burnett.